Hi, I'm Mrs. Wackerly, and this is chapter 25 of Roland Smith's Peak. This chapter is called Shortcut. Gulu had hauled a lot more than Sunjo out of the porter camp. On the other side of the hill was a small mountain of climbing gear, coils of rope, oxygen bottles, masks, tents, food. I wondered how we were going to get it to the upper camps. On our backs, as it turned out, because Zopa went right to work dividing the gear into 5 separate piles. As he sorted through the stuff, I asked Sunjo what was going on. He didn't know much more than I did. He said that Gulu had woken him in the middle of the night and told him that they had to leave the porter camp right away. At first I thought Captain Shek had discovered I was there, he said, but then we were safely out of camp. When we were safely out of camp, Gulu told me that Zopa was leading you and me to the summit in a separate expedition from your father's, but still on his permit. I didn't tell him how I found out because I was still mad about it and a little embarrassed. Yogi and Yasha's loads were bigger than ours, but Sunjo and I still had plenty to carry. We had most of the food divided between us. Zopa laughed as we grunted under the extra weight. It will become lighter as you eat your way through the contents, he said. There is a reason why base camp and all the other camps above it are situated where they are. The traditional route may not be the shortest way up the mountains, but it is the safest and easiest. Not that anything is safe or easy on Everest. Zopa's shortcut might have been shorter, but it was 10 times more difficult than the regular route. Our first obstacle was a vast field of jagged ice sticking out of the ground like great white shark teeth. Sunjo and I used our walking poles so we didn't slip and impale ourselves. The Sherpa brothers didn't bother with the poles, forging ahead like they were ice skating until they were 2 tiny dots on the horizon. I think Zopa could have easily kept up with them, but he slowed his pace, staying about 100 yards ahead of us so he could glance back once in a while and make sure we hadn't stumbled and were bleeding out on the frozen fangs. By the time we caught up to them late that afternoon, Yogi and Yash had the camp set up, food on the stove, and were amusing themselves by throwing their ice axes at a wall of ice that appeared to brush the sky. My legs were shaking uncontrollably from fatigue. My neck and shoulders felt like they had been worked over by a sledgehammer. My only consolation was that Sunjo looked more done-in than me. He didn't even have the strength to get the pack off his back. It took 2 hot mugs of tea before we could talk. By the 3rd mug of tea, I was able to focus enough to take a good look at the wall. It seemed to run for miles in both directions. I figured the next morning we would follow it until we came to a pass, then make our way to the top. When I mentioned this to Zopa, he laughed and pointed directly above us. "This is the pass," he said. "You're kidding." He shook his head. There wasn't a single handhold or foothold for as far as I could see. It made the ice wall I'd been practicing on look like an indoor rock climbing wall. After dinner, Zopa turned on the radio and we listened to the mountain chatter. 3 more people had made it to the summit that morning. 8 had turned back within a few hundred feet of the top. A climber had broken her leg up at ABC. The virus seemed to have run its course, and everyone who had stuck it out at base camp was rapidly getting better. I was about ready to call it a day and crawl into my tent when Josh came on the radio making small talk with one of the expedition leaders at Camp 4. This was very unusual. Josh was a firm believer that the radio should only be used to transmit important information. He hated it when people used it like a cell phone. They talked about the weather, the woman with the broken leg, and scheduling summit attempts. "Heard you had a falling out with your son," the leader said. There were no secrets on the mountain. "Yeah, he left," Josh said. "But we'll patch it up when I get down. He's a good kid. I think Captain Shek was going to try to yank his climbing permit anyway. Not that I would have let him. Is Shek still hunting for that other kid?" "Yep, still on the warpath. He detained a porter this afternoon named Gulu. He didn't let him go after a pretty tough grilling, but Gulu didn't know anything. That kid left here weeks ago. Not sure what he's trying to prove. I heard he was having some more soldiers trucked in. Some of them are climbers. He's going to send them up the mountain to check the higher camps. It's insane. I sent an email to the Chinese government, and I have my lawyers checking into other official actions. The Chinese make a lot of money on these permits. It'd be ashamed if one overzealous soldier dried up that revenue source, but what are you going to do? Anyway, good luck at Camp 5. I'll check in with you tomorrow. Out." Zopa switched off the radio. The entire conversation had been set up for us, at least on Josh's end. We couldn't participate, but we could learn a great deal by listening. None of us liked the idea of the Chinese climbers coming in. "They won't be able to get past ABC," I said. "They haven't had time to acclimate." Perhaps, Zopa said. How do we get by them on the way down? Sunjo asked. Zopa shrugged. But this time I think he really meant it. He didn't know. By the time Zopa kicked Sunjo and me out of our sleeping bags, Yogi and Yash were already 50 feet up the wall, setting up ice screws so we'd have something to hook onto. The sun was barely up. They had to have started when it was still dark. We ate quickly, packed, then strapped on our crampons and harnesses. Zopa said he was staying below to tie the packs and would climb last. A bitter wind blasted the wall head-on, which was good because it pushed us into it. If the wind had been coming from an angle, it would have blown us right off the wall. Ice axe in each hand. Dig crampon in. Bury axe. Ice splinters in your face. Pull. Dig other crampon in. Bury axe. About 65 feet up, I clipped into an ice anchor and took a breather. Yogi and Yash had already reached the top, dropped ropes, and hauled up all the gear. Zopa had just started up the wall. Sunjo was clawing his way up 20 feet below me. He seemed to be struggling, which wasn't too surprising considering he had been sick for the last few days cooped up in a porter's tent. I waited until he looked up and gave him a wave. He returned it with a grim nod. I started again and had gotten about 3 steps when I heard the yell. It took me a second to get myself anchored so I could look down. What I saw wasn't pretty. Sunjo had slipped down about 10 feet and was hanging on the edge of a protrusion by one axe. I had seen the protrusion on the way up and knew it was too far from the wall for him to get his crampons planted in the ice. "I'm coming!" Zopa shouted up at him, but it would take him at least 45 minutes to reach him. Sunjo wouldn't be able to hold on for more than a few minutes. I was a lot closer, but the only thing harder and slower than climbing up an ice wall is climbing down an ice wall. I looked up, hoping to see Yogi or Yash, but there was no sign of them. They must have already forged ahead to set up the next camp. I didn't even have time to think about what I was going to do next, which was just as well. I started scrambling sideways across the wall toward the gear rope 30 feet away. Zopa continued to shout encouragement to Sunjo. He was climbing the wall as fast as he could, but he had to know that no matter how fast he went, it wouldn't be fast enough to save his grandson. When I finally reached the rope, I gave it a tug. It seemed solid enough, but I didn't know if it would hold my weight. The brothers might not have anchored it properly because they were just hauling gear with it. "I'm slipping," Sunjo said desperately. "I'll be there in a minute," I shouted. "Hang on, Sunjo," Zopa shouted, catching on to what I was trying to do. "Don't give up." I wanted to test the rope, but there wasn't time. I hooked onto it and gave it all my weight. It stretched a little, but held. I swallowed my heart and crabbed my way backward towards Sunjo. When I got directly above him, I quickly hooked the rope to an ice screw I knew was secure and rappelled to him, getting the rope hooked on his harness just as his axe slipped from the ice. "Got him!" I shouted down to Zopa, then looked at Sunjo. "You okay?" He nodded. He was crying. So was I. Apparently, I had forgiven him. It took us another hour to get to the top. Zopa got there about 10 minutes after us, looking concerned and relieved. "Nothing broken?" he asked. Sunjo shook his head. "What happened?" "My axe broke." Zopa nodded, then looked at me. "Thank you." "You can thank Yogi and Yash for securing that rope," I said. "The first thing I did when we got to the top was check it. The rope was tied to a carabiner attached to a 3-inch ice bolt that wasn't going anywhere. Sunjo and I could have played Tarzan on that rope all day long." "But you didn't know that," Zopa said. "Yeah, well," I said, a little embarrassed. "Yogi and Yash know what they're doing." "Not always," Zopa said. "One of the axes Sunjo was using today was the same one they were throwing in the wall yesterday afternoon." Uh-oh. I suspected they were going to hear about that when we caught up to them, and I was right. When we got to the camp, Zopa took Yogi and Yash to the side and spoke to them for a good 10 minutes. He never raised his voice, but when they came back, they looked like he had whipped them. 2 truckloads of Chinese soldiers got here today. Josh was talking to a different expedition leader who had just arrived at ABC, along with 6 military climbers. The place looks like an army encampment. "Glad I'm up here," the leader said. "Well, you're not off the hook. From what I hear, they're heading up the mountain tomorrow morning to check everybody's papers. If you don't have your passport, visa, and permit, they're going to boot you off the mountain." "We have them. What's his problem?" "When the truck that Zopa and my son left on yesterday got to the second checkpoint, Zopa and my son weren't on it. The driver claimed they got on a second truck and went another way. I hope your son's okay. No worries. Zopa wouldn't let anything happen to him. I'm sure they're well on their way to Nepal by now. I thought I'd just give you a heads up about what's going on down here. Thanks, the other leader said. What about the Chinese climbers? Are they good? They're gung-ho and well-equipped. They pulled them off of high-altitude climbs, but I'm not sure where they were. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried for the summit while they're up there. I know I would. I hear you. It's going to get crowded at the top. Zopa and the brothers spread a map out and started talking in Nepalese. What's going on? Zopa says we can't stay in any of the camps until we reach Camp 5, Sanjo explained. They're picking alternative sites. I looked at the map. We were just about parallel to Camp 2, but 7 or 8 miles up to the north. It would take us at least another day to pull up even with ABC. We would be up on the summit in less than a week.